In this video, I'd like to look at some aspects of the literature review. So to start with, what is a literature review? And basically the very short definition of this is that it is an overview of the previously published works on a topic. So what is the purpose of the literature review? What it's going to do is it's going to summarize the existing research that we find in the existing texts, so be it journal papers, books, online or other media forms. And it's a way for us to find our gap in our work and trying to either replicate what somebody else has done to prove that something works, or to see what that gap is in the literature and try and find out how we can fill that gap and move scientific knowledge forward. It's also going to help establish the contexts of the research and help justify why are we actually doing this. Is nobody else doing any literature, any work on this, and we can't find any literature? Does that mean it's a completely new study or it's a novel study? Or do we know what other people have done and we can now try and meet our needs amongst these other pieces of work and fit our information in with what they've done? The last point on the slide there is something that's also quite important. It's going to demonstrate the evolution or what historical perspective has been done. So some studies you might find in literature that they are location specific, they might be date or time specific, and if you look at the literature you might see that as the studies progress year on year, decade by decade, something might change, something might evolve, and how are you going to take that evolution further in your research? You're not going to know how to take that further unless you know what exists in the literature itself. So the first thing that I want to look at here is how are we going to structure the literature review? There are various different ways that we can do this, and we'll come to something later on which we call the funnel or the telescope idea. But we could either structure it chronologically, that means we can structure it by time, so who did something first, how was that built upon year by year, decade by decade, or we can structure it by a theme or a topic. So for example, if you're looking at a biodiesel project, you might want to look at themes such as the biological side of it, and then another aspect might be the diesel side of it. There are two different aspects of it that you might group that way. When we structure the literature review, we are obviously, or maybe not obviously, going to work with subheadings, which could be based on those different themes or periods. But the most important thing is that no matter how you do it, we want to have some logical flow. We're going to start with a general idea, flow through to something that's a little bit more specific. The key here is that, is the reader going to follow our story? So this might be a scientific type publication or literature review, but we need to make sure that it still follows some logical sense. We cannot have bits or paragraphs and sentences that just stand alone. We can't have one fact, two facts, three facts listed one after the other as if they were bullet points without helping to guide the reader from one point to the next. We also want to make sure that the way that we write this is going to make it easy for the reader to be able to compare what we are showing in our work, potentially how we are going to be able to compare to our work when we finally get done with it, but lay it out in such a way that it's easy to follow. I think that's the main key point of this slide here. The way that we lay that out could be in straight text, so you can write sentences, paragraphs, and pages of literature review, or you might want to include things like pictures, tables, any other photos or illustrations that you've got to help guide your reader to break up the potential monotony of text after text after text. It's also important not to repeat yourself too much, so if you've already said something in the text, you don't need to have a table and a figure and a photograph on top of all of that. If you've said it once, that should be enough for the reader to understand how you're doing it. So make sure that you choose the correct thing that you want to show, text, table or figure or illustration, so that when you've structured it as a whole, you've got a nice, easy flowing document. So when you're performing a literature review, the first thing is going to be, where do we find this literature? What are we actually looking up, and how do we find, or what are we going to be looking for in order to put the things that have been historically written into our document to show what's been done before? Now, there are various sources where we can find literature, and the most suitable source in most academic settings is going to be a journal article. The reason for that is that it's peer-reviewed by multiple reviewers. There's been some sort of backwards and forwards between the author and some reviewer to see if this is suitable science, it's suitably written, is the grammar, the language okay, has it been structured properly? So typically that is the most ideal source for your literature review. Books are also often a common source because the author has taken a lot of effort to put his work into publication. So they're not going to typically write a whole lot of nonsense, so they're generally a fairly reputable source. Sometimes we also find that we might need to go to other sources, so not necessarily journal articles or books, but things like magazines and non-peer-reviewed items. These may be suitable depending on what else is available out there in the literature, in the books and things like that. We might also look at interviewing people, so it is also possible that if there is no written documentation of something, we could use media interviews from people and their knowledge. The experts in the fields who have years and years of expertise can give us their insights into what we are going to be looking at. This might also be dependent on what we are looking at in your study. There might be geographical influences, so we don't want to waste our time going through literature that is only relevant to a certain country when our work is very specifically based in another country, although there might be reasons to do that. But we also want to have a broad enough basis of our sources of literature that we get a full picture of this without going overboard on this. It's also important to include the seminal works in the field. And what we mean by that is, what is the one key document that everyone refers to on your topic? So there might be a textbook or a journal paper that's been cited thousands and thousands of times because it is just that good. And it's important that you don't miss out these important references or these important pieces of work and reference them and include them in your literature review. What happens next, though, is that you've got all of these different pieces of literature from textbooks and journals and media, newspapers, magazines, online sources from the web. And what you find is that you've got little snippets of information on select aspects of the topic you're working on. So you might get one source that tells us that biodiesel is an important source. You might get another example of literature that tells us how biodiesel is made. You might get a third one that tells us why biodiesel is made, and various other little aspects. The key to the literature review is the synthesis and putting these pieces of information together. How are we going to put the story together that each of these ones flows? What I don't like to see is that we have one paragraph on one fact with a reference at the end, a second paragraph with a reference at the end of key findings from each of the journals or books that you've read, and these paragraphs then don't flow from one to the other. So one of the things that might be more beneficial is, when you're writing your literature review, is not to just write down a fact on your document and reference it, the next fact and document and write it, is to put all of those things to the side and write the document yourself. You've read all the literature now and you know the key aspects of what it should be in that document. Once you've written some of the things in your own words, and this also helps against plagiarism as well, is to then go back to the notes that you made from your literature review. Who said that piece of information that you remember highlighting in paragraph 1? Who said the piece of information in paragraph 2? And it might be more than one author that said it in each of these things. Structuring that literature review into a logical flow needs to be something that comes across in your own words, because often if you just cut and paste, firstly you're plagiarizing if you cut and paste multiple paragraphs one after the other. It's different people who wrote those things, and in your mind you're trying to paraphrase something from each of those authors, and you still get the sense or the essence of the way that they speak and they write. And it's very obvious when a reader reads this that there's a different style, there's a different grammar, there's different wording that comes across in each of these. So again, like I say, write this as far as possible in your own words. The key aspects that you're finding, then bring those back and then reference and look at those. When you've then done that, go back to all your literature. And is there anything that was said that you didn't include in your own words? Is there anything that you need to add? This is also a time when, how are you going to include the tables, the graphs, the illustrations, the photos, maps, anything like that? Are they actually necessary? And when you include them, make sure that you are going to include a caption on each of them that clearly describes each of these illustrations, these visual representations that you're adding. I tell a lot of students that I'm a lazy reader. I might have a lot of things to read, particularly when I'm marking final year reports. And I'm going to skim through a lot of literature reviews, and I'm going to look at the pictures, and I'm going to look at the tables and diagrams to get an understanding of what it is in that section or around that section. So I like to have, or I encourage you to write a caption that fully describes what's in those tables, those graphs, without me having to read any of the text. If you've given me enough information about it and you draw my attention to those illustrations, I will then stop and read the paragraph that surrounds that illustration to get more understanding of what it's in there. If I'm already irritated because I don't understand what's in the graph, it's not a good sign if I'm marking your document that I'm actually going to be interested in reading the words if you've now already irritated me. When you are reviewing the journal articles and books and the literature that you are using to incorporate the ideas of into your literature review, it's important to assess what methods have been used, what rigor has been included, and is there any bias that has come across because of some study that is being done. If it is a study trying to show me that a paper product is much more environmentally friendly than a plastic product, but the study was being paid for by one or other of those individuals, is that really an open and transparent study? And sometimes it might be, but just make sure that you look at it critically. Who's been paying for the research? What was the intention of the research? Was there a potential bias before the project started? Is there a location bias? Was there enough of a study done? Are we trying to say that there's a certain pattern that's observed in the world's population, but the sample study size was only located in one country for 10 people? So we can't make estimates based on such a small sample size. Has the sample, or has there been any repetition done in the study, either in the study that you're looking at or in the literature that you're looking at or another piece of literature? Has somebody been able to reproduce the results? In a scientific study, is there any statistical analysis that's been done? So all of that rigor adds to the validity of the paper and can give you confidence that using it is going to be helpful in your work, in the literature review of your work, and then moving the work forward as well. One of the key aspects of a literature review is to help identify the gaps. So these gaps are often where you are trying to do your research, or where research is lacking and where potential future other research might happen. So are there any unresolved questions or inconsistencies in the findings? So these might be an area that you might want to investigate further. Have you thoroughly looked through all of the literature to find out if this is the case or not? Sometimes there might be trends that are evolving, and I've heard this one particularly in electrical engineering or cell phone technology. We had 1G, 2G, 3G, 4G, 5G, all of these new technologies for cell phones. Is there something now coming out for 6G, 7G? So I'm not an electrical engineer, I wouldn't know, but what are the trends that you've seen in the literature over the last 5 years, 10 years? Have things been changing that rapidly that if you're telling me about the references or the references from 2, 3, 4 years ago, are those already out of date? Are the emerging trends that quick that you need to pick up on them as they come and get published? The identification of these gaps also helps to suggest further areas of potential research or investigation. So these are probably going to be your areas of research, and that's why you're doing your study, but there could also be other areas that could be looked at. So coming back now to what we are looking at in this literature review, and I mentioned earlier that we have an idea of this funnel or a telescope. So from all of your ideas that you've put together, the ideas that you're writing down either through a brainstorming exercise or you're writing it because you are now doing the actual work, the idea is to start with a very broad topic. So I've already mentioned my broad topic of biodiesel. So the broad topic here might not necessarily be biodiesel, it might be diesel in general. It might even be petroleum-based products in general. So diesel, petrol, paraffin, kerosene, those types of things. The next step is to then bring it down to a more specific area. So depending on where you're starting in your broad topic, and this might depend on if you have a time limit, a page limit, or just so that you don't want to confuse your reader and give them too much of a broad topic, the more specific idea could now be, for example, just diesel. So no longer petrol or petroleum products, it's just simply petroleum diesel. So any studies or anything that you need to tell me about any of these more specific ideas would be the next step in synthesizing this literature review. We then go down to even more specific ideas. So here the example could be that we're previously looking at diesel, we're now looking at the bio-based form of diesel. We carry on like this until we can focus in on our area. So depending on the work that you're doing, you might be doing a chemical engineering project where you're looking at a very specific catalyst or some very specific form of oil or reaction setup. And by the time you get to the end of the literature review, you need to have covered everything that comes down to focus in on your work. What have other people done that has been similar to your work? Are there other people that are also looking at a specific location, a topic? The specific topic in this instance, the catalyst that you are looking at, has anybody ever done something similar to your work? And you finalize this work with the point of that funnel to now tell me what it is exactly that you are going to be looking at, or where are the gaps? Why has nobody or has anybody ever done your specific project before? In a PhD project, there needs to be some novelty in the work, so typically nobody has ever done your work. In a project at master's level or fourth year or any other final year undergrad project, you may find projects that are very similar. Some might even be identical. So the idea here, you don't have to necessarily worry about the novelty. Your project might have a different location, a different time, a different feedstock. So don't worry too much if you do find something that has been done before, unless you're a PhD student, of course. The next area to consider here is a theoretical framework. So what are the relevant theories or models that need to be introduced on how you've taken your literature into the method and into the actual research work? What theories are you going to be using that help to develop the work that you are using here? If there are several theories, evaluate the applicability of these theories. Which one is most applicable to your work, your circumstances, your scenarios, and explain or set out how this theoretical framework is going to work in your project. Are there any modifications or adaptations for this? And how do these theories relate to practical implications? In a lot of studies that I've seen, this is more applicable in the humanities, the social sciences, where they talk about theoretical frameworks and how these are going to be structured. In sciences and engineering, these don't often come out as explicitly as a section or a heading in a document. However, there are some things that we need to lay out depending on your readership of your work. So are there any models or any theories that you need to explain? Are you going to have to explain how a reactor works before you actually go and do the reactor modeling and design? So if your reader is an engineer, you might not need to explain all the basic mathematical models or the complex mathematical models of how a reactor works. But if your readers, and this might be for a consulting report or something else, if your readers are business people or your funders that don't necessarily know the engineering principles, do you need to structure or lay out those mathematical equations into the work and then expand them to show how they are relevant to your work? In some studies, this theoretical framework, or in engineering rather, these models, the developing of the models or the background of that, can sit in a chapter outside of the literature review. I've also seen it sitting at the end in an appendix where you reference in the literature review, if you are unsure about how these models are developed, please go and see the basic mathematics at the end. So a reader can then decide, are they going to read through all the basic stuff that other readers might know or not? So give the reader that choice. Another thing to keep in mind across all of the work that you do is not to assume that your reader knows everything. It's also important not to assume that they know nothing. So there's a fine balance that needs to be made where you give enough information that your reader understands what's going on, but you don't make them feel stupid at the same time for explicitly giving them grade school lessons. As part of the literature review, you might also want to discuss some of the methodological approaches. Are there different research methods used? Can you evaluate the strengths and the weaknesses of these methods? So we're not only going to be looking at literature of what has been done in the past, but how was it done? So how was the method approached? What are the gaps in these methods, or are there any gaps in these methods? So sometimes in engineering, we might see that there's a very standard method that's been used, but they haven't looked at certain temperatures or pressures. So what are those gaps that you might find in the method of other people that have worked before you? Are the methods even appropriate? So are we going to be looking at something that is operating at too high a temperature, too low a temperature? Are the laboratory setups that have been proposed in the methods actually applicable to the real world? Have we got such controlled scenarios in the lab that once we leave the lab, these are never going to be true? So are they actually really appropriate? In this methodological discussion as well, are there any ethical considerations? So in engineering, we typically don't have that many ethical considerations beyond questionnaires asking people certain things. Most of the time, this is not sensitive information that we are asking them, but please don't forget, particularly as an engineer, if you're listening to this, that we do need to consider these things and don't just brush them aside. If there is any ethical considerations that need, if there are any ethical considerations that need to happen, often this needs to happen at about this stage. So depending on where you're applying or what you're applying for ethical clearance, you might have to have your proposal completed, or a literature review or a method section of your report, or you might need to have done it even earlier because there is some time lag in some of these application processes. The last one on the slide is there any innovative or uncommon approach that you've found? So is everyone doing method A when you're doing some study, or has somebody more recently decided that everyone has been wrong for the last 100 years and there's some new approach? Is that approach that you're going to follow as well? And why are you going to follow that? Is it because you trust that this one person has now come up with some very fancy method of doing it, and this innovative way is going to be unique? Or were the last 100 years of science correct and you're going to go back and go do that original method? So whether you use it or not, just make sure that you highlight those approaches. Key to all of this is that you must remember that you still have research questions from your introductory chapter. You need to remember what those research questions are. And in your literature review, are you helping to push forward the idea of how you are going to answer those research questions? Or are you getting sidetracked on a tangent and starting to tell me things that are actually irrelevant in line with your objectives and your research? The literature review needs to have a broad understanding of the topic, but don't make it so broad that you're now telling me about things that have nothing to do with my objectives and are just wasting everybody's time reading the document. This is particularly true when we start with page limits and word limits, and you want to make the document look more fancy, more impressive. So let's add another 10 pages of literature review when it has absolutely nothing to do with the work. So please avoid that mistake. When you are working on your literature review, also make sure that it's clear to the reader how the current study is going to contribute to the existing knowledge that is out there. So this again comes back to how are you going to identify the gaps in the knowledge, and how are you going to make sure that you fill these gaps. At the end of your literature review, make sure you've connected the literature to all the aspects that need to be connected. Make sure that you highlight the relevant aspects of those previous studies and set the stage for the next chapter, which is often going to be your research method chapter. How are you now going to go about the work? So in this literature review chapter, you might have reviewed or looked at the literature on the different methods available. Your method chapter would then go, what exactly are you going to be specifically doing in your work? At the end of a literature review, or one of the last sections of the literature review, I often ask students to draw a table for me. And in this table, I ask them to write down in each row all the studies that they found in the literature review. In the first column, just give me a study number. What in each of the columns that follow are the key aspects of it? What was the method, the location, the key findings, the results, any conclusions or recommendations from this? It's a nice way to summarize what everyone else has done in specific studies related to what you're doing. You could potentially also add your study on the bottom of that table to show what it is that you are trying to answer. And even though we haven't done the method yet, it's probably maybe not always relevant to highlight what parameters are you going to change or you're going to look at in your study, and how that is going to relate to the literature that has gone before. While this last slide is titled Conclusion of the Literature Review, this doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have a heading called Conclusion, as this isn't always the case, but it can be quite useful. The literature review is often quite a few pages long, so anything from 10 to 15 pages, all the way up to, I've seen ones as long as 60 to 80 pages as well. So 60 to 80 pages is probably a little bit too long for most of us, but if you've been reading that many pages, it's important to be able to summarize the key findings, emphasize the importance of the study, provide a seamless transition to the next section, potentially reiterate the research questions on just to remind us what it is you are doing and how you are taking all of this forward, reinforce that significance of addressing the gaps, and encourage some sort of anticipation of the study's results. This one is a little bit, in my mind, if your literature review is getting a little bit too long and you're having to tell me again what all of these aspects are, Have you maybe put too much into the literature review itself? So it's a nice way to end it. Don't make the conclusions section too long, but it can be a nice way just to end off on that literature review.